Well, welcome to the Small Town Podcast, a resource for arts professionals. I'm Sara Roach-Lewis, and I'm really happy to be here today talking to Hannah Bell about board management. So I'm just going to do a little introduction for Hannah. She was elected as the MLA for District 11, Charlottetown-Parkdale, in 2017, which makes her the second member of the third-party caucus. She's also the Green Party finance critic and the third-party House leader. She holds an MBA in Innovative Management from UPEI and has 30 years of experience in public, private, and not-for-profit sector in Canada and the UK. Before she was elected, she was the executive director of the PEI Business Women's Association for 5 years. And as the chair of the board of governors for the Guild, Hannah is also the owner of a consultancy firm, the Solution Agency, working for businesses and community organizations on building capacity and influencing change through the power of storytelling, practical training, and skills development, also through strategic planning, partnerships, and sustainable project design. Hannah really comes to this conversation around board management naturally, given that she is representing the province as a governor in the National Trust Canada and as a champion for Startup Charlottetown, part of the Startup Canada Entrepreneurs Network, and a member of Rotary International. So welcome, Hannah. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Wonderful. Well, we're here today to talk about board management. Mm-hmm. And so I'd love to just have you start with talking about what do you see as the role for boards within organizations?
Well, it's a question that it's amazing how many people work on boards or work with boards and don't know what those roles actually are. So one of the first places to start is what is legally and officially the role of a board. And the board is actually the overall kind of delegated responsibility for the management of an organization, delegated by shareholders or stakeholders or members or whomever is set in their constitution. The board has a fiduciary responsibility, so basically they are responsible for the fiscal management and usually a legal or risk responsibility as well. So what that means in real terms is that the board is the one that is actually responsible in the event of there being, an issue or concern, whether that be legal, risk-based, or financial-based. And often board members serve without knowing that is actually their responsibility. The other side of that story is that organizations are run by staff who report to boards. But what we know from, you and I both have had much experience with boards, and we know that the reality is that the day-to-day of an organization is with the staff. And sometimes boards think that they report to the staff rather than the other way around. So those relationships are actually really critically important to the health of an organization and to the health of the day-to-day functioning in terms of what those organizations actually deliver.
Yes, absolutely fair enough. And I think, really one of those key and critical pieces that you say there is around that fiduciary responsibility and that responsibility to managing the risk for the organization. What, in your experience, what do you see as being, a good relationship? What does a good relationship between board and staff look like?
Well, it's one of mutual respect. And really good, honest communication. Often, boards can be comprised of people who are there for different reasons. And so sometimes people are motivated to serve on a board because it's their passion. It's something that they feel very strongly about. Sometimes people are there because this is good for their career or for their resume or for skills development, or other times they're there because they bring a very specific skill set that organization needs. And getting that balance is really important. The same thing is with staff as well. So understanding sort of why people are there and what they're working towards in terms of common purpose is sometimes a conversation that boards and staff don't have. They assume roles and kind of fit into those roles without sort of asking, okay, what are we actually trying to do here? And unfortunately, that sometimes means that boards maybe don't do the deep dives or the deep conversations that they should. It becomes very rote. They show up, they do the meeting, they read the stuff, they talk about it, they go home. And they're not asking the questions that they should be asking, which can be a real problem if there is something they should be looking at. And vice versa, staff in an organization may feel that the board is interfering, or we're not going to bother them with that, or maybe we should just not let them know about this yet so we can get it sorted out. And so those are well-meaning from both sides, but often can be the root of some real challenges, and not bad ones necessarily, but just the absence of real honest communication. I think one of the key things around being on a board is you need to be committed to actually be there, not just show up, and there's a very big difference.
What does that difference look like for you?
I think people really underestimate the time commitment that being on a board is. This is not 1 hour a month at a boring meeting. This is not only the time at the meetings, but there are usually committees that need your attention because they're functional. You should be reading and preparing before the board meeting with any materials that are provided or required. You should be paying attention to what the organization is doing and going to the events that they hold, or engaging with them on social media, or helping to promote in whatever your role is that you can offer. Sometimes board members financially support organizations. But, that 1 hour meeting, it's only a small commitment, is not the real story. And board members can be such a critical piece of the success of an organization that really sort of being honest with yourself about whether that's a commitment that you are prepared to take on, and what you can get from it as a board member. I've always said to people, one of the most career-fulfilling things you can do is to serve actively and intently on a board, because not only will you learn a huge amount, but you will also develop some really good relationships with other people there if you give yourself the opportunity to do so. And they can be really powerful relationships because those are people who are like you.
Well, I think that raises a really good question from the flip side. Mm-hmm. So as the management, like as the staff or the executive director of an organization, who, at the end of the day, it's really the board's responsibility for their own management. Mm-hmm. But in practical reality, that board recruitment often falls, at least in part, to the executive director or to the staff. And I know from a personal perspective, I have been asked to sit on boards with the pitch being, it's not a lot of work, the food's really good, those sorts of things. So thinking about it from that other perspective of the management of the organization, if the board is really, or if the organization is looking to recruit the kind of board member that you just described, how do they go about doing that in a way that has an accurate picture of what the expectations are, and they don't feel as though they're going to scare people away? I think that's sometimes why we minimize that.
Yeah, and I'm laughing a bit because that's exactly I've had that pitch too. And as someone who has worked as an ED, I've been in that situation absolutely. That we talk a lot about sort of. For boards that kind of nose in, fingers out, you need to know what's going on, but you don't need to be in the day-to-day, and the other way around from a management perspective. But boards are really not necessarily self-sustaining. It's rare to get to a space where you have a board that is so invested in its value to the organization that it is able to sort of manage its own, and that's our ideal kind of on a pedestal version.
Sure, yeah.
But it doesn't mean that you can't strive to that. So I think we underestimate how many people would really be good on a board if they understood what that role actually was. Often it's one of those kind of things that somebody else does. So part of our challenge with this is really explaining about that being on a board is a volunteer role with a responsibility, but you are protected in that responsibility as long as the organization has its proper things in place, like liability insurance. Absolutely. And policies, which we can talk about in a bit. Mm-hmm. But being a board member is actually limited risk, but there is a responsibility. And so one of the things that I really encourage people to do is to talk honestly about what that work looks like, but why that is so valuable, and why they should consider being on a board, even if they've never done that before. So we also have to get out of our own way in terms of what we think a good board member could be. Some of the most effective board members I've met are people who have never done that before and would never be your people that you would pick on your list of. And so how do you do that is there's a couple of things. One is I really encourage and not just because it's something I do in another life, but I really encourage organizations to have a plan of some form that says, what are we doing and why are we doing it and how are we going to get there? So whether you call that a strategic plan or a map on your wall or a scribble you did on a Sunday afternoon, it doesn't really matter, but you need to have a shared vision that your board and your staff and your stakeholders or membership or whoever is your community have agreed on in terms of your overall, why are we doing this work? That immediately sets context for people who are going to align with that vision, because you need accountants and you need marketing people and you need, but they still have to at least be passionate in some way or supportive in some way of what you're trying to achieve. It doesn't mean that you should have a board full of people who are exactly like you or, have drunk the Kool-Aid necessarily. But if you are an animal rights organization, you don't need somebody on your board who is not. It's going to be a real challenge for you because you're never going to align on vision, and that means those board meetings are going to be combative and probably toxic. So that vision helps immediately qualify the field. And then the other piece around that is, what do we need to get to that vision? And your board are as critical a part of that team of what we need as your management skills are. You need somebody with some kind of financial background or experience. You need somebody who has good contacts in the community. So by able to scope those things out, then you're actually looking for people with skill sets or people with assets that they can bring to the board rather than, I know Jill and she did this thing before, she'd be great.
Sure, yeah.
So there's more work on both sides, I guess, is the really short version of that. You need to invest in it.
Yeah, fair enough. And so just from a really kind of practical perspective, when you're talking about that, do you... I love that idea of we actually need to all have a vision. So it's that big picture. What are we doing? Where are we going with this organization? And then on that really specific piece, do you recommend organizations have a bit of a board matrix so they identify what are the skills that we need to have on our board and then track that so that rather than a bit of a willy-nilly approach to who's going to sit on your board next, that they're being able to really see where are the gaps in the skills that they need on the board.
That's exactly it. It's one of the things in terms of, a toolkit for effective board and board development. Ideally, within your bylaws for your organization, you should have some flexibility in the scale and size of your board. So rather than saying we need exactly 5 people, ideally you have a board that allows you to have 7 to 9, or, so that there's a little bit of flexibility in there. If it means that you have one less seat, but rather than filling it with somebody that isn't the right fit, then that's a good decision. But the board matrix isn't exactly what that does is say, what skill sets are critical and what skill sets would be nice to have.
Sure.
What are things that we need as an external expertise? And again, I come back to accounting as one of the ones that's most common. But what are also things that we can develop and train? Because that's another carrot for board members is we will provide you, hey, you want to learn about social media, and it's going to be really valuable to us. We're going to teach you social media skills because we recognize that we need that on our board, and nobody here really has it, but we can teach you. So you can invest in your board and board development, and that is really relatively low-cost investment, but that's a huge incentive for potential board members and for retention of board members, but also to sort of build and develop the skill set that you need, and and then that way, recruit specifically for the things that you can't train. So a board matrix, and one that's realistic. Again, understanding what are the skill sets that you have to have legally because of that fiduciary responsibility, because of the things that are set out in your bylaws. What are the things that would be nice to have? What are the things that actually should be happening in the organization and not necessarily in the board, right? So, the board is not responsible for delivery of training. Maybe the board doesn't want to be a fundraising board, which is quite common, right? That we know that boards for large foundations are almost exclusively a fundraising board, which is very different from a small town arts organization that needs a board that can actually help them get shit done.
That's interesting. It's such a great perspective. And I have a friend who I did a year-long leadership training program with a number of years ago. And she works for a Tira Women's Resource Center in BC, and she does the fund development. Mm-hmm. And her perspective on boards and fundraising is that every board member, regardless of the organization, should be making a financial contribution to the board. And the way that they identify that or describe that is as a meaningful contribution. So whatever that meaningful contribution is, mm-hmm. It is a really interesting perspective.
It is.
We have some ideas around, a board is a board is a board, and then we land on things like what is the financial management? What does that look like in relation to that kind of fundraising piece?
I think that's a really important thing to be. This again comes back to that really open and honest conversation. If you want a board because that board has community connections which allow it to make sure that you can sell $1,000 tickets to your fundraiser, then you need to be really clear that that's what you expect from your board members. And if you want a board that you want to show up and roll up their sleeves and help you figure out how to develop and deliver a new program that is part of your long-term strategic vision, then you also need to be clear about that.
Absolutely.
And whatever that looks like in between. Mm-hmm. But certainly any organization which has a charitable arm, for instance, with a foundation or associated management of a large a fiscal envelope, will have some expectation of at least some of those board members to continue to develop and grow that aspect of the organization, because that's how they run.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So talk to me a little bit about what you see the difference between plans and planning, and where does the board intersect on that planning piece for the organization?
Sure. Well, I'd mentioned earlier about how critical it is to have a shared vision. And you and I both know the value of that engagement in the planning process. I am less excited about plans, and because I see the planning process, which is effectively having that incredibly empowering, engaging conversation with the key people in the room. That's the place where passion comes from. That's the place where we get those kind of big light bulbs that happen going, oh, this is where we're going to go now. This is the new big space for us. We are often, particularly from a business perspective, very focused on needing, a 48-page business plan with our 5-year projections and things. And there is a space for those things. But in terms of the thing that excites and ignites people, that's not it. So, I really love visual planning. I love when you can have an event where you have somebody that does the visual scribing for the day and creates that gorgeous piece of like a living artwork. I am a real fan of having one-page strategic plans that basically say, here's our key things that we said we were going to do. And that it's a poster that people can put on their wall and refer to every day. Because frankly, that's the kind of plan that gets done. Something that has very focused vision, very clear activities and objectives, a clear delegation of authority. Words will kill us sometimes in burying us in waffle without us allowing to be really clear about what it is that we're doing or even who's doing it. And boards will often be utterly bogged down in talking about things, meeting about the meeting, and not moving forward. And when they do that, the organization that's waiting for direction is paralyzed. Or they go off and do their own thing because they don't have direction at all, neither of which are good for that long-term vision.
Sure.
So the short version of all that is be careful when you are planning that you don't work just to develop a plan. The process of planning and engaging everybody who should be in the room, ideally staff and board at the same time, and ideally stakeholders in some place in there, is absolutely critical, because it's better then that you find out at that stage if people are on the same page or not, and you can work to address it rather than finding out 3 years later when you don't get where you thought you were going to go.
Absolutely. And what do you see as, from my perspective, one of the things that I've always found a little challenging around a planning process is when an organization has a certain amount of requirements that they have to execute on the actions. So if you're a project-based organization, you are really driven by the projects that you have in front of you. If you are an organization that has operational funding, that operational funding is still tied to something. It's tied to outcomes. So how does an organization balance those two things? On the one hand, it's really, and I so critical that we hear from the board, the membership, staff. How do we balance that in a way that's practical with the contractual obligations that the organization already has?
Yeah, and I think it's absolutely one of the kind of key challenges that we have, especially for smaller nonprofit organizations,
Yes.
when we live in a space where operational funding is the golden goose. And I would add, even before I answer the question, there is also a third aspect of that I'd mentioned earlier around that organizations that have foundation-based funding who often have a different set of criteria,
Sure,
which is to
absolutely.
show a fiscal return and not necessarily sort of outcomes-based as much. So we're going to leave them off the table for a minute because that's, I think, a bit of a different conversation. But so project-based versus operational funding. So they still have, in some ways, some similarities. You often have, as you said, very clear kind of things that need to be accomplished, whether they're measured as very specific goals of a thing to be delivered, or whether it's a series of outcomes and performance measures. And so we can look at those as a problem or an opportunity. The problem side of it is this restricts us and we can't do these things we want to do. The opportunity is this sets a really clear scope of the space that we can work in. How amazingly creative can we get inside that scope? And if we know what our end product has to look like, but we have a lot of flexibility, and sometimes, not always, but often that's the case, especially with project-based funding, is we want to achieve this at the end, but how we're going to get there, we're not quite sure yet, and that's okay. Then that gives you this amazing space to be incredibly creative with, well, what about if we put this piece and this piece together, and then we can share that resource and we can free up this piece over here, and so it does limit your space, but being limited does not mean that you can't still be creative and problem solving. Sometimes having too broad a scope actually reduces our capacity to be creative because where's the challenge? And so it's very much about that lens, and I know it sounds very kind of fluffy in some ways. It's kind of like a half full rather than a half empty. But it really does matter if you start the day saying, look at this, this is what we've got to work with, and that's okay. What could we do within that space? What are we absolutely required to do, and where are the gaps that we can get creative? And then think about some of those things that don't necessarily have such a hard outcome associated with them, which is the opportunity to develop skill sets, the opportunity to educate and to speak to people through channels and medium that don't have necessarily a price tag associated, like social media. The opportunity to add in some additional measures that matter to you that weren't in the original project, but they matter, and if you gather that data now, you can use them to leverage something else for the next opportunity. So again, it comes back to that vision of, especially with project-based funding, the last thing we want to see is organizations actually have to change where they want to go because the funding made them. What we
Absolutely.
want, ideally what we're seeing is that there is at least some alignment with where are we going and what are we doing for the money that you get, which means that there's an opportunity there to develop relationships with those funders and say, we're doing these other things as well. Can we talk to you about that? So I'm a big fan of pushing back. I'm a big fan of saying, hey, we also do all these other things. Did you know? Can we talk to you about these pieces? Have you considered? And there's some fantastic examples of organizations that have really pushed and worked with their funders and developed really positive relationships to get some more flexibility in what they're able to do because they've shown how creative they've been able to be. I do think, though, we are in a space particularly for essential service organizations, and I think arts organizations are essential service organizations, to be really clear about that, where we have to have at a funding level, i.e. government and government partners, we have to have a conversation about when is too little, because we will see organizations disappear and leave space that can't be filled if we don't recognize the responsibility to address core funding as something which is of huge value to achieving those outcomes. So I will certainly be clear that I will be continuing to advocate for core funding for organizations in addition to project-based funding, and I think the combination of the two.
Yes, I think there is something to be said for the combination of the two.
It's a good fit because it allows a lot of flexibility while still getting paid, which is kind of awesome.
It's pretty critical.
Yeah.
So there's so many places that we can go. I do really want to spend a little time on the bits that we tend to think are boring until it all goes to hell. So that would be
oh, right, that was important.
Yeah. That is important. So what do you see as the value or the importance of the structure, the policies and the procedures within an organization to ensure that there's a good balance when we think about that board relationship with the staff?
Sure. Well, I mean, we talked earlier about sort of what's our time commitment at a board and that the board isn't just a meeting once a month and then going away, but policies and procedures are one of those ways where the board can have an influence on the organization and that kind of role of risk management, fiduciary responsibility when they're not in the room, which is ideal because, they shouldn't be in the room, but their presence should be. And so what policies and procedures do are, particularly policies, if we start with those, are set some of the kind of basically the rules and guidelines about what is and is not acceptable. And the most common ones that we can think about are things like confidentiality and privacy. We now have social media policies are key, workplace safety, for, management of funds. So, how much can people pay for stuff without having it signed off by somebody, for example. And those are unfortunately often done because something's gone wrong. Sure. And there are, though, some fantastic resources, and we can certainly share some of these, for people afterwards. But there's some great resources about sort of what are the really good basic policies that every organization should have in place. And it is remarkable how few actually have them, or they've got them somewhere in a binder and nobody knows where it is. And so one of the other pieces about policies is you don't need a lawyer to do them. Mm-hmm. They should be readable. They should be plain language, and they should be reviewed and updated regularly, and the staff should all have read them and signed them and be on file. Because in the event that something does happen, that then becomes the piece that you can refer to. But ideally, that process itself of going through and saying, hey, we actually have a privacy and confidentiality agreement, so no, you can't send that email with that person's information in it. Better to have had that conversation up front because the policy helped guide you through it, mm-hmm. Than suddenly have a crisis that you have to address later. And so, that's the key role of policies, is policies should be determined by the board, based around some of the key things. And again, there's that kind of simple basic checklist of the basic ones you should have, and then whatever is specific to your organization. Often nonprofits have a requirement for 2 signatures on payments, but that's becoming a bit more difficult now that we have things like credit cards and debit payments and e-transfers. So what do you do for those aspects? How do you handle cash? How do you handle a complaint? Mm-hmm. How do you handle potential harassment? So all of those pieces can be determined, or even if it's a matter of rubber stamping basic ones, by the board, and then the board puts those in place as per their authority with management, and management are responsible for ensuring that staff understand and apply those policies. Procedures are a bit more sort of what do we do day to day. So a procedure may be a manual, it may be a checklist. I like the checklist rather than the manual, but it's the how do we do something. And those are particularly useful if you have repetitive tasks or you need to ensure quality control of something that's being done on a regular basis. So processing a payment when it comes in would be a procedure which then connects to your policy around the handling of money, which connects to the fiduciary responsibility that the board has for the organization. So you only need policies and procedures that relate to your organization, but you need policies and procedures that relate to your organization. And sometimes you will find you need to develop one because you have to react. Ideally, you have at least the core ones in place to prevent.
Sure.
Yeah.
Where do you see the role of governance, like finding the right governance structure for an organization, especially small organizations like many of the ones that we're talking about here on Prince Edward Island? Where do you see, and what we tend to see are when the organization transitions from maybe more of the board being really active to when they start to have staff. So where do you see governance, like making sure that there's a governance structure in place?
So we can go from, effectively what's an operational board, hands-on, sleeves rolled up, doing the things, to a strategic board. And, we can talk about a lot of these things in theory, and the reality is that's actually what happens. And at some point, you're going to need to make a decision. But ideally, you've had that planning space where we talk about where are we going, what are we going to be when we grow up? And part of that is recognizing that that's an aspect of the transition. It's really challenging, though, because we don't tend to stop and recognize where we are in that. It's usually way afterwards when we go, oh, yeah, we should have done that thing. It's also really hard for people to let go of being operational, because often when they get engaged with the organization, it's because they actually want to be doing the thing.
Indeed.
And so the theory is awesome, but I'm the first to recognize that the practical of that doesn't look a lot like that. It's usually a lot messier. Often, in fact, what happens is that boards never get out of being operational unless they actually make a hard stop, do a redo of the organization, and that's the place where probably you start writing things like bylaws. Because initially when an organization gets going, those are the kind of things that it doesn't do at the start. So that kind of hard place where you can really implement a change in governance structure will come with bylaws and the associated resolutions that say, this is actually how we function, and then the associated conversations that go with that. But that can be really challenging for organizations because you're changing the nature of who you are. And certainly having worked with organizations that have done that successfully or not, you can lose your passion and your focus because you're losing the people who are actually running the organization. So that operational board effectively means that an organization will not survive, because it's when those people are done working, they go and there's no one else there. So what happens for organizations that have an operational board is they have a finite life. If you want your organization to survive, you actually have to move from operational to strategic, even though it hurts, and that you will lose people who have been a fundamental. It is a transition of growing up. In the same way when you grow up and you move from being a teenager into being adulthood, the people who are your best friends just kind of aren't your friends anymore. Sometimes you lose people who you thought were the most important people in your life, and you grow out of them. That's what happens for boards. And it can, in a small community, it can be really challenging because those people don't go away. They're still at the coffee shop, or they're in other organizations that you work with. But if you don't make that transition, your organization will actually die.
And I think that is a really good point in terms of the age and stage of your organization. Really, that plays a role in what that board management looks like and the relationship between the board and the staff. Yeah. And I think that really dovetails nicely into the last thing that we were wanting to talk about, and that is sort of your tips and tricks for working effectively with boards.
So we've talked about them a couple already. I'm a big believer in that having those planning sessions around vision, and that means that you don't just do that once every 5 years. You actually need to do those really every year, because you're bringing new people into your space. So whenever there's a change in new spaces, even if you haven't had that change, just to refresh and remind people who we are and where we're going. And it's also a really great way for people to sort of develop relationships with each other. So to do some kind of a retreat style approach where you actually ask people to commit to a full day or, at least a half a day. You feed them, you tell them how much you value them, and you invest in them, and therefore in the organization. So whether you're new or you're an older one, that is a really critical thing, and it's such a small amount of work for such a great return. The next part of that is then you also need to follow up. So what do you learn from that, including the hard conversations? Sometimes those conversations mean that something that the staff really love to do doesn't get done, but we have to drop a program or service that the staff really love. But if the board is saying this doesn't fit, it doesn't work for us, they get to decide that because they represent your stakeholders and your membership. So being committed to the hard conversations and the hard decisions, as well as the fun and the easy ones. We talked about the board matrix, and I think that's a really important, and that needs to be a living document, and really changing that conversation that you have with board members about how them investing in the organization means the organization will invest in them. So whether that's in development and training, whether it's in providing support for things that they can do to help forward their career, networking, those opportunities, that this isn't a chore, this is an opportunity. So that change of lens. Investing in really good, even if they're coming from templates, really good basic policies and that kind of checklist of, the checklists are your friend. I'm a huge fan of those giant sticky Post-it notes, like flip chart size Post-it notes, because you can make checklists that you can put in your main room in the office and work your way through. And so key plans on those so that you can see things are getting done. But, a couple of days investment and you can have some core policies in place. That open and honest communication, board meetings by their nature have some things in them which are not, thrilling, like having to review financial statements. Do your board actually understand what they're looking at? And the answer is probably not. So how can you change that narrative? Can you put that conversation into language that makes it make more sense? This is what we did, and this is how much it cost, and this is where we found some savings, and now we can do this great thing instead, rather than let's read the balance sheet. So, really kind of thinking about the lens of these things of how do we actually make sure we're making decisions together, and giving people the space and the respect that they want to actually see what your organization is doing is the right thing, but understanding that means that sometimes you need to sort of try on some different board members for size. Your board also need to give the staff and management the delegated authority to do their job without interference and trust them to report on what they are doing without interfering. If you ask the staff to do something and it's a month later and you're bugging them about it, then you're doing it wrong, right? So that thing of delegated authority really matters. If you have a good, open, honest relationship of trust, and you also have the mechanisms to be able to check, you shouldn't be phoning or stopping into the office just to see how things are going. That's really distressing for staff to feel that they're not trusted, and it's something I hear about a lot from that working relationship is micromanaging from board members is actually really inappropriate. So set those parameters and have board members understand what delegated authority actually means, and vice versa.
Yeah, I think absolutely, and I agree wholeheartedly, and I think the where that communication is really critical is exactly what you just said. It is really important for boards to be able to delegate and also have the mechanisms in place to know that what is said to be happening is actually happening. Because at the end of the day, that is a tension for them because they are the ones with fiduciary responsibility. Right. So there is really an interesting and delicate balance between, particularly executive director and board. And I think we have those examples of how it can work really well. And I think certainly what I've heard you say today is it is one of those key and critical pieces of managing a not-for-profit organization is ensuring that there is that really good board staff communication and engagement.
Absolutely. It's one of those areas I think we tend to miss in the hustle and the bustle. And I do think sometimes nonprofit staff are not as appreciative of their boards, in terms of their attitude as they could be. Boards are not there to be a pain in your butt, and if they are, then you need to look to yourself in terms of also why is that, so that it's a two-way relationship, and I'm having been on both sides of it. I've been the one getting the emails going, oh, you've got to be kidding me, when it's for board meetings. I've also been the one going, why don't these people read their emails? So there's a lot of things that you can bring to that, but a lot of that is that lens of how am I? Is this of value? Are we within what we agreed as our? So frankly, one of probably the most useful tips is a clear and honest communication agreement as part of your strategic plan. We tend to think about how we communicate with our members or with our constituents or with our stakeholders, and we don't actually put agreement in place that says how do we communicate with each other.
Well, Hannah, that is fantastic advice. And really, that if there was the one key tip, that is certainly where it is. So I do really want to say thank you. You've given us so much to think about when it comes to that board staff relationship. So thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. That was great. Love to do it again. Cheers.